Good afternoon, everybody. We gave everybody an extra few minutes to get here, and we're about to start the event. Just got so quiet. Welcome to the 9th event in the 2015-2016 IPAC NWT Monthly Speaker Series. My name is Dennis Marchiori. I'm the Vice Chair for IPAC NWT. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to go over logistics, because I'm not only the Vice Chair, I also work at the city. So the door you came in is the door you go out if you hear an alarm. It's quite simple. If that door is blocked, I will guide you to a back hallway and get you out another set of doors. If, while you're here, you wish to use the bathroom, go out these doors and straight across. If the door is locked, it means somebody else is in there. Probably do not break in that door. That's all the safety messages I have for you, and now we'll start. As many of you know, the Institute of Public Administration of Canada, IPAC, is a national organization dedicated to excellence in government administration at all levels. The role of NWT Regional Group of IPAC is to make this objective real and relevant at a local level and organize events on topics that interest all public servants. We're very fortunate to have here fantastic speakers on the subject matter, and today's subject is Governing from the Regions, a discussion on the role and function of government administrators in regional centers. We also have, and in terms of format, what we're going to do is we have a set series of questions that we're going to ask our speakers. They're going to present the information for those questions, and then at that point in time, we'll look for any sort of questions from the floor up to our speakers. Just making sure. We also have, the event is scheduled to conclude for 1:30. It may finish before that. We understand that some people have only an hour for lunch, so if you have to leave before that period of time, please get up quietly and you can leave the room. And if you are able to stay for the full time, if we have extra time at the end, if you wanted to talk to the speakers, we also allow for that to happen. Just it's a little bit better on a personal level to sometimes ask a question, not in a large group. So we have some of our board members present for IPAC NWT. I see Jenny, I see Shannon, I saw in the back Sherry. Jamie's here. Did I miss anyone? So those are your board members. Those are the people that try and organize these events and get everything going. So I would like to thank all of them for coming out today. And Chris, I'm just doing notes from someone else. I'm actually facilitating to help. So I'm trying to go over this stuff and make sure that I've gotten all of his wordings down. Okay, so that's done. Sweet. Okay, so how do governments administer programs and services at various regional centers? What differences are there between regional centers? For instance, how is the experience from the vantage point of Yellowknife to Ottawa, or from Behchokǫ to Yellowknife? It is as simple as stating that policy is a purview of capitalists and implementation that of the regions. What are the dynamics of government administration when it is undertaken by people and so very close to the people? Though regional governance is a common reality throughout the country, there are northern differences that really stand out. To address these and various other considerations, we have a great list of panelists who will share their considerable experiences on various aspects of regional governance. Now I'll introduce them. We're fortunate to have Mohan, Denetto, the Regional Director General of the Northwest Territories Regional Office of Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada. Mohan will be offering his federal perspective from different geographic vantage points. It's a pleasure to introduce John B. Zoe. He's the Senior Advisor to the Behchokǫ government. John will offer various perspectives from the Behchokǫ government and how regional governance works internally and with other governments. And lastly, I'll introduce Michael Conway, who is the Regional Director with the Department of Transportation of the GWT. Michael will offer his thoughts from his current role and from having worked for many years in India as well. And I get to see Michael vote once a week as we go through the forest fire season, so that's always fun too. So we're going to start with the first question, which is, what does governing from the region mean for your government and from your particular vantage point? Can you explain those dynamics a bit? And we'll start with Mohan.
Well, thanks, Dennis. And I'll just make a few comments and pass it over to John. You know, In terms of being a federal office in the Northwest Territories for INAC, the question asked to look at it from two perspectives, from the government's perspective and my vantage point. So what I'll do is just explain a bit, what the regional office's function is in the Northwest Territories and what the government expects it to do. There are three fundamental roles that the regional office plays. It's the eyes and ears for INAC in the Northwest Territories to understand and know what's going on and be aware of the environment. And then the other job is to advocate for the interests of the Northwest Territories, for its residents, for Northerners, and for Indigenous groups in the Northwest Territories. And then you turn that around, and it's also to implement federal decisions as they play out in the Northwest Territories. So kind of three fundamental roles. You can pretty well put anything we do into one of those three categories. From the government's point of view, as you know, we're into a new mandate, new government, and definitely a new approach to how to do things. What I'm finding so far, you probably have heard of Minister Bennett. She's very active. She's on the road a lot. She's already been to the NWT for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Inquiry. So she's very active and out there on the road. For her and for the government, there is a high reliance on the regional offices to be the eyes and ears and to understand the regional context, especially for things like ministerial visits, but also in the development of policy and programs and executing their mandate. Again, in terms of the current government, there is an expectation of the regional office play a role in conveying the interests of the Northwest Territories in the development of national policies. An example in the budget that I was just dealing with today is the additional money to Nutrition North Canada. So there's a very important program to the Northwest Territories and to many northern regions in Canada. So part of my job is to convey to the government, what are the interests of Northwest Territories, what's my perspective, and so from the regional perspective, we're asked for that input quite a bit. And then the final phase, of course, the government has a very ambitious agenda on many fronts, and the regional office is expected to implement on that agenda. So that's kind of the government perspective, and many of you may have heard of the term deliverology, which the current government is using a lot. Well, for example, I expect there's going to be a deliverology unit in Ottawa. I'm going to be expected to have some kind of point of contact for that unit, and so anything that I'm going to implement in the Northwest Territories is going to be heavily scrutinized if it's part of the government mandate. And so that's on the kind of the implementation end of things. From my vantage point, again, according to those three categories, definitely I have to develop relationships in the region to understand what's going on. So that means I have to do a lot of outreach, I have to do a bit of traveling in the region. So I'm doing more of that this year. The last 2 years I was really focused on rebuilding the region post-revolution. I have to understand what the interests are of Northwest Territory residents so that national programs can fit in the Northwest Territories. So it's an interesting situation because the majority of programs and services are delivered by the government of the Northwest Territories, as it should be. But certain federal programs, like I mentioned, Nutrition North Canada, some of the health programs, et cetera, are still delivered or funded by the federal government. And so INAC, because of its historic role, is often called upon to provide advice, even if it's a program that's delivered or by another department, such as Service Canada or Health Canada. And then, from my vantage point, implementation. And there's initiatives that are fun to implement and initiatives that are less fun to implement. And at the end of the day, I provide all the advice I can into the executive committee in Ottawa. But when a policy direction is given, I have to implement it. So I would say there have been some initiatives that have been more difficult and challenging to implement. My colleague John can probably mention the board restructuring one as one of the more challenging files, and we all know where that ended up. But as a government official, we were obliged to implement that direction. That was a direction given us. It was popular, we did it. There are other initiatives that are more popular, and we are also expected to implement that. So I'll leave it at that, just to give you a sense of the role of the regional office, or where we play on the government agenda, and how I see that role from my perspective. And I'll hand it over to my colleague.
Thank you. I guess that some years ago, before we had a land and self-government agreement, we were really governed by the region, from the feds, and also from GWT in terms of what rights are delivered, and programs and services. And the agreement that the intentional agreement was settled in 2005, which gave us the recognition as a governing body for our region. And since then, we've put into fine print, I guess, the structure of how the policy development happens, the lawmaking authority, the body, and the implementation of those laws that are passed. And the work is done by administration and reported back as it is. So the revenues that we get are all self-raised, at least 75% of our revenues are monies that we raise ourselves, so we're really self-funding. One of the thing about self-governance and the exercise of it is to make sure that the reason for the government is the strengthening of language, culture, and way of life. Because if you're talking about self-government, you're talking about identity. That's what makes it unique, because your identity is based on your landscape and the information on that landscape, and trying to bring it forth as part of your assets and all the things that go with it. And so we've been developing new relationships with the federal government, renewed relationships with the territorial government in the delivery of the programs within the region. So most of them are things that we develop ourselves through agreements by our staff, and making sure that those reports are filed at the end of it. But it gives you a chance to tweak it when you're doing the delivery, to make sure that what you're doing is really strengthening the language, culture, and way of life within the region. And it also means a renewed relationship with industry, and the major industry in the territory is mining. So we've been meeting with regular meetings with the big three, including the developing ones, including the ones that are just in exploration. We meet with them at least regularly, at least twice a year. So but for the bigger three, it's much more frequent. And the other things that we're doing is trying to work with NGOs, because a lot of the public policy is within that area for trying to, I guess, have a say, or trying to influence public policy in doing conferences with NGOs, and setting up, we've set up a research institute to deal with research that's going on within our area. Some of them are licensed through the Aurora Institute, but we get a chance to look at the applications and see how we can collaborate with those researchers so that we help identify people and subjects with them. So it's a lot of these things since 2005. We're into 2011. We've had our 10th anniversary last summer, and so we're on our 11th year, and we'll be going into our the 4th assembly, I think. So it'll be our 4th election, and the election is structured so that there's an element of publicness. Even though we're an Aboriginal government, we have a sense of publicness because we're dealing with an exchange of funds, an exchange of programs that are delivered to non-provincial citizens also, so that our structure is designed so that it doesn't scare away federal or territorial governments, thinking that it's going into a sinkhole, as media likes to put it, for a number of years. But it's really about being accountable for those funds that we're responsible for and report back on. So those are things that we've been working on in the region. And when I say in the region, that almost everything that happens in our region, the provincial government has something to do with it. And like our road building that's happening with DOT and with wildlife management, with ENR, and our regular meetings with cabinet and the chiefs, and relook at some of these programs and retweaking it so they have much more meaning within the region. That's it.
Okay, I'm Michael Conway. I'm Regional Superintendent with the Department of Transportation. Our responsibility here in North Slave is to take care of Yellowknife Airport and 4 of our community airports. We take care of Highway 3 basically from here in Yellowknife to the junction of Highway 1. We take care of Ingram Trail, and we also take care of Highway 1 from basically from the junction to Red Knife. So it's a fairly large region geographically. And the driver vehicle licensing office is also taking care of that North Slave. So from a North Slave perspective, it's a fairly broad mandate. In the Northwest Territories government, with the DOT perspective, there's actually 4 different regions. So there's the Inuvik region, there's the Behchokǫ, there's the Hay River, and of course up here in the North Slave. So looking at governance, I guess for me, and because we're what they call a nuts and bolts organization type of thing. I mean, we're not dealing with big policy issues or anything like that at DOT. So for me, I guess it's representing the people you serve, making sure your policies and programs and all your projects are working for the people in the regional communities. And the only way to find that out is to get to the communities and speak to the people out there. From a personal perspective, it means not making assumptions. You tend to have bad results when you're making assumptions about what people are thinking in a particular area about a particular thing, be it an ice road or an airport or you know, a health policy. Making assumptions is generally not something we want to do. It means having face-to-face discussions. It means looking at various alternatives for different programs, for different ways of getting things done. It means working hard to find solutions that may not just work on one level, but work on many levels, and that's usually what we're trying to find. And from a regional superintendent position, it means being accountable. So you have to be personally accountable in the communities and the places you serve. When something goes wrong in your particular organization, you have to be able to stand up and say, you know what, this is my problem and this is our problem, and we're going to solve it together. But from an accountability perspective, this is where it stands. So you'll get to see me on the news now and again when there's a forest fire, road closure. We get to talk about things like that. We get to talk about why isn't the winter road into the Behchokǫ region yet. I get to talk about those types of things. So there is that accountability part that I think, from a regional perspective, is very important.
Okay. Thanks, Michael. I did like your comment on the assumptions. That was very good, and it leads me into the next question for the panelists, which is, what role does collaboration play in your government's regional administration? And can you give us an example of a successful collaboration you undertook? And I will start with John this time.
Well, one of the things that we collaborate on, and sometimes from observation too, is if we're dealing with an exchange of programs and services, we need to, I guess, show that we have accountability. We have things that we can report back on. We can show where the money goes and how it's spit out and where does it go. But in the end, it's really about who handles it in the communities. What type of positions do we have in the community, and how our ability to deliver, I think, is very important. So one of the things that we've done right off the bat after 2005 was we inherited all the workers from like the band councils, and 95%, at least 95% or even 100%, there was no job descriptions. There was no pay grid. There's no training. There's no advancement. There's no insurance. It's just, that's the way life was. So one of the first things that happened was job descriptions were developed with the workers. And job descriptions were based on what we thought that the government would require. And employment agreements were developed so that everybody has a comfort. And annual evaluations are being done even till today. So that little over 10 so far. And in those annual evaluations, what it does is that we see what the differences are, the actual between the person's ability and the job description. And if there's a shortage of somewhere or lack thereof, then training will be required to try to fulfill those things. But at the same time, it gives an opportunity to relook at the grid, because we have a grid system as where people fall into different categories based on their abilities and knowledge. And the last thing, I guess, is that each position is competitive within the ranks of government. But then there's another category called the executive appointments, which are done by whoever gets elected, and those are mostly the executive positions. But at the same time, one of the interesting things was getting insurance for the workers for the first time. And it really helps going to the dental without having to wait for an okay from Mohan. So you get kind of service gets upgraded if you have insurance, and it's good to kind of throw your insurance card on the table and walk in. But and we have what do you call our pension plans that all the workers get and all the benefits that go with it. So it really makes a difference in the amount of training that goes on within the region all the time, and more programs are being developed. And it's really about self-sufficiency and the ability to transport that information based on the strength that you have in your language, culture, way of life, to do implementation in communities where people are much more receptive and much more willing to participate.
Mohan will have you go next.
Okay, thanks, Naz. I'll point to one example I thought was a really good example of collaboration with the government of the Northwest Territories over the past year. You've probably heard of the insolvency of North American Tungsten. And as part of the devolution agreement, the federal government agreed that if any operating mine on a certain list becomes insolvent within 5 years, we take it back. And so the Canton mine fell into that category. And you know, the interesting thing with a devolution agreement is it's a theoretical document, and you don't really know how it will work until you try to make it work. So there were a bunch of provisions in the devolution agreement for handing back a mine. But when we started to actually go through the process, we realized that the devolution agreement, while in theory it was fine, from a practical point of view, it didn't work on a few levels, especially in providing certainty for both governments in terms of how the process would work, the amount of risk that each government would be taking on, how you would handle the security requirements that needed to be handed back to Canada, how the project would be taken over for care and maintenance. So there were a bunch of things that weren't clear in the devolution agreement. So, you know, in this case, things could have gone really badly or really well. Unfortunately, it went really well, and I think it's because we had very good collaboration with the Department of Lands. And I think collaboration really depends on the people that are involved, because the legal parameters of what we're dealing with were the same. But you have people on either side of the table or around the table, and if those people are people that you can work with, that are willing to be flexible, that are willing to compromise, that are willing to balance their interests with your interests, then you can have a very successful file. And so the end result in that initiative is that the Canton mine was transferred seamlessly back to Canada. There was no break in operations on the ground. There were no environmental or health and safety risks that occurred because of the transfer back. That said, there were fundamental disagreements between Canada and the GNWT in terms of things like security. And I think what's exemplary of that bit of collaboration is both governments were able to park or put aside their differences so that we could collaborate where we had areas of common interest, which was basic public interest in ensuring that the mine site was well managed. We're still working through some of the areas of disagreement. But nevertheless, we were able to collaborate to make sure the important stuff got done. And I think even in the areas of disagreement, it's still a fairly collaborative approach. It's not a confrontational approach. It's sitting down and discussing, you know, how can we work through these areas of difference or disagreement while still meeting the common interest of both governments. So for me, over the past year, that was a very good example of collaboration on a regional level, both between the regional office and NWT, Ottawa, and the Department of Lands primarily.
From a collaboration perspective, I would define it as working together to attain a common goal that may not be attainable independently. For an example, I guess I would go with the one that John B. and I have been working on for many years. We're both part of the Behchokǫ Roads Working Group, and we've been working for, well, probably since 2012 on a project description report so that we can one day build an all-season road from Highway 3 to the community of Wati. The group was put together from people that work from the Behchokǫ government and people that work from the Department of Transportation. The Behchokǫ government was responsible for the TK work and the socio-ec perspectives of the project description report, and DOT handled the engineering and environmental sections. It was a very large piece of work. Probably, I think we printed it out. It was ridiculous in size. And it took a tremendous amount of work and a tremendous amount of collaboration. We did a lot of community visits. We went to all the different Behchokǫ communities. We talked about the project at various events, whether it was specific for this or even just at community meetings. We strategized together. We looked at common goals, and we really worked together as two separate governments to try to come to a successful conclusion. On March 31st, we submitted the project description report to the Wheezy Land and Water Board, and they are reviewing it as we speak. The next step on the collaboration for us, though, is to find a way to pay for it. So we've been collaborating with the federal government, P3 Canada, working with them to put a business case together. We initially put an application in where we have to compete with huge projects across the country, and we were accepted into sort of what they call round 7, which is a place where they will sit and work with you and try to get your application to a point where it's reasonable and it has good value for money. And that's where we are this day, is working with them, and we expect to have that finished quite soon. So that would be a good example, I think, from my perspective of collaboration with multiple governments.
Excellent, thank you. And some of the things that came out of that question were some of the program delivery, the self-sufficiency. The other thing I appreciated was talking about the community level and dealing with residents and every order of government looking at how they do that differently. And of course, communications among the different orders of government is highly important. So which gets us to our third and final question before I open it up to the floor, which is, what would you say are the unique elements to regional governance in the North? And we're going to start with Michael this time.
From a unique perspective, I don't think that the question works for me, because if you're in the Northwest Territories, it's not unique. It's how you do business. So, I mean, we work with multiple layers of government. We work with community governments. We work with Aboriginal governments. We work with the city of Yellowknife. We work with other governments. So I think it's just part of what we do here. And if you want to be successful, and you want to get your projects through, and you want to make positive changes, it's just something that you do as part of your regular working life. So, thanks.
So I will then pass it over to John.
I guess what makes it unique is how you develop that uniqueness based on the structures that we have and the authorities that we also have, and how we, I guess, harmonize our decisions to get away from conflict. What we have, other than GNBT and federal service delivery, we have 4 communities, and we have offices in those 4 communities. We also have a regional office, and the other one we have is a satellite office here in Yellowknife, staffed by about 10. And most of the activity that goes on over here is in developing collaboration, developing partnership, and meeting with people that don't have an opportunity to go into the region. So if we develop something, then we can maybe get them to go into the region over time. We have a staff of over 100 on a daily basis, and we're dealing with at least 12 million a year that we're dealing with. And our structures and decisions that are made by our assembly, which is the lawmaking authority, is that they develop the budget for the year. And one of the laws that are in place is that at the end of the year, we should have a zero balance with no deficit. So in the last 10, 11 years that we've been operating, we've had zero deficit each year. So we don't owe anybody anything. But end of the year, we have a zero balance, and then the whole cycle starts again. So that's one of the uniqueness of this thing, is that the federal government is all about collaboration. It's all about giving opportunity to its citizens where opportunities didn't exist before. And if they didn't exist, then we need to develop it. And if we need to develop opportunities for enhancement, then we need to do that. And one of our most prized things is in the graduations. Because when we started this thing back in 1996, our graduation rate back then was 2 or 3 a year. And there's graduation happening in the community. That's why the leadership is not here. They sent me to tell the best jokes. They're at the graduation because it's the highlight for the community. And so at CJBS in Edzo, the graduation amount, I think it's hovering pretty close to 40. And so 40 has been around the average for the last 10 years and growing as up to those 10 years. So we have a large population to deal with, and we need to develop more opportunities for enhancement and mobility for the communities, but at the same time give a strong message that they have a language, culture, and way of life, and we need to enforce that identity. Is that you have a place to implement, but it doesn't hurt to be mobile at the same time. Awesome.
Thanks. I think, in terms of the unique elements to regional governance in the north, I'll probably talk about what I know best, which are the regulatory boards. And, they've had their challenges over the years, but I think it is fairly unique to the north. You do have similar boards in Yukon and Denetto as well. But I think the rest of the country can learn some good lessons from that. So it is unique and it is a strength. Because I think the boards really are a reflection of, as my colleague mentioned, how you do business up here. It's a reflection of the consensus style of government, which is very northern. We talked about cooperation and collaboration. My view on that is if something can't be done in a collaborative way, you got to ask yourself whether it's worth doing, right? And I think in my interactions in the north, most people take that perspective. You need to get communities on board. You need to get the GNWT on board. Sometimes the federal government plays a role. But the most successful initiatives are collaborative initiatives, and I think the boards are a reflection of that. Over time, we've started devolving responsibility for the boards to the GNWT, and it's working very well. But it's a reflection of the various roles of Indigenous peoples, of public government, and public officials working together to get something done. And the other thing that's very unique about the Northwest Territories is the need for strong relationships to get anything done. And again, I think the boards are a reflection of that. They represent certain relationships, again, between communities, Indigenous groups, regions, levels of government that somehow all work together in harmony to get very complex proposals like the road to Wati through a system where it's fully vetted, where everyone feels that they had a say in the development and implementation of a project. And so you cover off a lot of aspects of governance of resource development just through the board process. And if you look south of 60, you know, I think the co-management concept was developed because of the history and culture of the North. I'm not sure it could develop in the South, but you can see a lot of cases where if you had a system like that, perhaps there wouldn't be so many controversies and conflicts about resource development south of 60.
I'm not crazy moving seat to seat, but we are also recording this, and I don't want to be in the camera all the time. So at that point, I'd like to thank all the speakers for their remarks. Do we have any questions from the floor? Don't be shy. Okay.
It's to Mohan, directed towards Mohan. You mentioned, Commissioner, we were talking about regional governance in the first one, dealing with the first question. Hoping I'm saying this correctly. What are the types of relationships that you have, that INAC has with the regional governments to sort of deliver on those three important, significant areas that you've been talked about, including implementation of programs and services? What are the types of relationships, I guess? And how are those relationships formed? What are they based on?
Yeah, basically, you know, we have a fundamental intergovernmental relationship with the GNWT, and so on many files we're interacting with the Department of Aboriginal and Intergovernmental Affairs. That's our typical intergovernmental role, but there are many other, there's kind of a web of relationships. And, you know, INAC, you know, historically has been around for a long time. I mean, going back to, you know, signing off on dental expenses, the old role of the Indian agent. You know, for better or for worse, we have a long history in the Northwest Territories. So those relationships are still there. So, for example, we go out every year and we do the annual treaty payments, right? And we hand out, you know, $5 bills. That's symbolically very important, and that represents our historic relationship with the chiefs, right? And so a lot of my relationships are with the chiefs, even though we don't necessarily have a program relationship with them in many cases, right? And then we also have negotiations and implementation of the treaties, which is still a federal responsibility insofar as the negotiations are concerned, in collaboration with the GNWT, of course, for the land issues, which is now involved. And so there is a clear relationship with the tribal councils and through the negotiating teams. And so we maintain that relationship as well. And that's a very clear conduit into the Northwest Territories. And then we have the interdepartmental relationships as well with our federal partners. So with RCMP, National Defense, Health Canada, Service Canada. So we have a federal caucus that we convene every so often to collaborate and coordinate federal activities in the Northwest Territories. So I would say those are kind of three fundamental relationships, you know, with the GNWT, with the chiefs and tribal councils, and then as well with our federal colleagues in the Northwest Territories.
Any questions?
Yeah, one.
Oh, perfect.
This is also Mohan. Let's look around the room and see a chunk of people that used to work for the department. I have a question with respect to the department sort of regional office getting smaller post-devolution, but with the recent court decisions that have essentially expanded the responsibilities of the federal government, do you see a change in the role of the regional office here with respect to northern delivery functions?
I would say it's possible. You know, post-devolution, certainly the lands and waters functions were transferred. The Aboriginal relations and program responsibilities weren't. So that still is a consistent factor going forward. You're probably referring to the Cap Daniels decision and the Métis. Again, speaking of uniqueness, the Métis have always been recognized in the Northwest Territories, and we're negotiating with the Northwest Territories Métis Alliance, and there are joint claims, a Satu and Métis claim, for example. So that reality has been recognized. So can't see necessarily changing our fundamental relationship in terms of negotiating claims or implementing claims. But there is the open-ended question about Métis that don't fall neatly into that category of claimant group, and whether there may be more programs and services available. That's an open-ended question. We don't have any policy direction, no decisions have been taken. It's still, the decision is being digested by Ottawa right now, and in terms of how that may play out in terms of programs and services, both south of 16 and the north. That said, I don't think that will fundamentally change the devolution of those responsibilities to the GNWT. In terms of social programs, housing programs, all the programs that were devolved, since the 70s, block transfers. It may change the funding profile. We can only hope for the Northwest Territories. It's always good to get more resources into the Northwest Territories, but there have been no specific directions conveyed to date on that.
Thanks, Mohan. Any other questions out there? John and Michael looking lonely. Okay, Jen.
My question is for Michael, and I'm wondering if there is anything about doing business in the region that you wish was better understood by the people in it.
Sorry, that was better understood
Better
by...
understood by the people in the capital.
Look around the room and see who's here. I think what we keyed on basically is that without the personal relationships, it doesn't really work out for you. You have to talk to people who live there, find out what their perspectives are in various communities, and they're not the same in every community. So you can't go to one community and say, well, you know what, I was there for 6 hours and I pretty much have it all figured out now, because it's not the same. When you go to a separate community, they have a totally different perspective on the same thing you might be discussing. So I think for people in various capitals, it would be, that's the key. They're small communities, so you look at them differently. We're not going into Winnipeg, we're going into Wati. So we're able to find out the truth of things a little bit easier in that type of situation. So that would be my answer.
And based on that question and the answer, I would pass this over to John and state, what do you see as a difference when you have people from a larger center coming out and working with your government?
One of the unique things about the provincial government is that we got rid of the Indian Act, except for how you describe who an Indian is. So the Indian Act doesn't apply to us anymore. It means that the Transparency Act that was introduced a number of years ago didn't apply to us, but we still put our financial stuff on the web anyways, because it's a good thing to do. We were doing that before anyway, so it doesn't really matter. One of the things about the agreement is that we're constantly working on the implementation of that agreement, and we haven't even cracked the book open yet. So we still have a lot of time. We still have a lot of things that any initiatives that happens, like the road to Wati, devolution, those are initiated by the existing structures. And so how do we plug into it in the collaboration and work on it so that those decisions that are being done in those different steps, public engagements are done in such a way that it gives credibility. And so we kind of feed off each other in that way. But there's also the existing deliveries that happen by governments that we need to tweak at the same time, because we've always maintained that programs and service deliveries before the agreement really was just about delivery, but not collaboration. So it's very important for us to inject new thought into it, so that one of the agreements that we have, like with programs and services, intergovernmental services agreement that we have with JWT calls for what we call a cultural coordinator. Cultural coordinator is basically to look at how programs and services are delivered, and that they have some element of language, cultural way of life in its delivery, so that we're strengthening the communities, individuals, and the region. And it's much more meaningful for the residents in the area.
Thank you for that. Are there any other questions? No questions. Don't make me ask a question. I'm not even going to ask a question myself. What we'll do is we'll conclude this. I did like the final comments that you have to have good working relationships with the regions. I also like the idea of the policy development and making sure that it works through residents. And I think that's something that across all orders of government, something that we strive for all the time, is to ensure that we do things and remember when we develop policies or programs of not only a large center like Yellowknife, Hay River, and Nuvik, but we think of the smaller centers like Colville and how they would deal with that work to make sure that we set them up for success and nothing else. So first, I would like to thank our three speakers for coming out and sharing their information today. And from IPAC NWT, we offer a small token of our appreciation. A few more things before I let everyone go, and then you can possibly ask the panelists questions individually. Our annual general meeting will be held for IPAC on June 8th. We have a lot of new members that have started, and we will be doing board elections. So I would, we'll send an email out for date and time reminder as well. It'd be great if you could attend. We also have an IPAC website, which is www.ipac.ca, which is the main IPAC website for Canada, and I believe ours is
Google IPAC and WC.
Yeah, and it comes up a lot faster. Let's just do it the easy way. We are also on Twitter and Facebook. We're pretty much everywhere, so you can join us and follow along. And finally, after this event, we'll send all the people who showed up a brief survey. We'd really appreciate it if you could fill it out and provide it back. Provides us some feedback so we can make these events a little bit more worthwhile for all of our members. After that, I'd like to thank you all for attending, and that concludes our event for the day.